What do you get when you spend $540 on a high-performance S7 katana? Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I'm going to be answering that question by reviewing this Dragon Sword S7 self-described high-performance katana. So as a quick disclaimer, I did not buy this sword. Dragon Sword contacted me and asked if I wanted to review one of their swords. I said yes, and this is what they sent me. Now, there's absolutely no compensation for me from Dragon Sword for this review. It is going to be my honest opinion, but I do get to keep the katana. So if you think that makes me biased, at least you know ahead of time. This katana retails for $540. Dragon Sword does this thing where they actually list it on their website at $700 and then mark it down to $540. They told me though that it will never sell for $700. It is $540 is the actual price. So let's talk about Dragon Sword for a moment or two. Like so many katana makers, they are based out of Longchuan, China, and their website and product line is very similar to XVII. Now, they're not the same company, they're not particularly related to each other. What Dragon Sword told me is that the owners of the two companies are friends, and XVII provides them some technical support. What does that mean? Well, for me, I work in information technology, so it has a very specific meaning, and I don't really believe it's much the same as what Dragon Sword is calling it, because they elaborated on that a little bit, said that XVII offers support such as polishing, Hob.X, saya, and some small number of fittings. Not really technical support to me, but that's what they described it as. Now, Dragon Sword does seem to have a larger selection of models than XVII, although XVII does offer customization, and their prices range from $78 all the way up to $3,500. One of the things I like a lot about them is that they offer the option to get Hishigami on all of their katana. Some of them come with it automatically, some of them it's an upcharge, and then it looks like some, or if not all, actually have a Hishigami Pro option, which adds $30 and presumably is their best attempt at utilizing Hishigami in a traditional style idomaki. And just browsing through their website, from what I see, most of their fittings and saya are pretty typical Longchuan fare. So this sword is made from S7 steel. What does that actually mean? Now keep in mind, I am not a metallurgist, so this is pretty much my amateur take on it. As I understand it, S7 offers both good toughness and edge retention in one difficult to process heat treatment package. I believe the heat treatment involves a vacuum quench because that's kind of how it's described on the Dragon Sword website. And since this is through hardened, there is no hamon, and the entire blade should be roughly the same hardness. Dragon Sword said they go for 55 to 57 HRC with a plus or minus 1 error margin. So the way I see it, if you're paying for an S7 katana, it should have both good toughness and edge retention. And what does that mean? So toughness, it shouldn't take a bend. You know, if it gets hit on the side or bad cuts, it should not have any issue with that. It should not bend. As opposed to a differentially hardened katana with an active hamon and a softer spine and a harder edge, oftentimes with bad cuts or anything like that, they'll take a bend. As for edge retention, it seems like it should be pretty simple. It should be able to hold an edge longer than other through-hardened metals. Now, I am not Matthew Jensen. I do not do destructive tests on my katanas, on any of my swords. But I figured for this sword, you know, S7 is considered something of a super steel by some. I needed to test the entire selling point of this metal. So I went through a couple tests, which I will show in just a moment. It's important to say that I did all of this testing after I had already disassembled the katana, and we'll get to why that's important in a little bit. So for the toughness testing, this was pretty simple. I took the katana and I whacked it against the side of some wooden posts in my backyard a few times with some good amount of force, but not excessive amount. These weren't love taps, but they also weren't full strength. And the katana performed beautifully. It did not take a bend at all. Now for edge retention, this was a little tricky. So first off, the sword came sharp, but not quite as sharp as I'm used to for a katana. It could cut paper, kind of. It did cut, but there was some jagged tearing in there. Now what I did was take it, you'll see this on screen. I apologize for the bad framing. I have not done this before, and it was windy that day. And, it's some bad footage, but it is what I have. So I did some paper cutting. I took the katana to a bog standard 2x4, which is made of compressed pine, I believe is the actual wood. And it's generally a pretty soft material. I chopped into that 2x4, I think it was around 100 times. It's going to be sped up here, so I don't blame you if you don't want to count. It was around 100 times. And then I took it back and tried paper cutting again. From what I saw, it cut a little bit worse. It seems to me like it did lose a little bit of the edge. Not a crazy amount of the edge, but some. So what does that mean? Should it have lost any of the edge? Should it be dulled? Well, I figured I needed some kind of comparison. Otherwise, I don't know if that's normal, right? So I took my Romance of Min Yuri Jikoku, which is also a through-hardened katana. I believe it's made of spring steel, but Romance of Min doesn't list what type of spring steel. And I tried to do pretty much the exact same test. I cut paper with it, I whacked it into the 2x4 about 100 times, and then I cut paper with it again. It definitely lost more of its edge than this S7 katana. How much? It's not a lot of difference from what I saw. They're both still functionally sharp. They can still cut, my type of targets, especially water bottles. They can still cut water bottles, but they both did lose some edge. The Romance of Min lost a little bit more, which isn't really surprising considering it's a sub $200 sword. This is a $540 S7 sword. So it's not a crazy difference in edge retention, but it is there. What to make of that, I'm going to have to leave up to you. To me, I do think it might have lost a little bit more of an edge than I would expect based on just cutting into a very simple, pretty soft wood. But that's just my opinion. I talked to Dragon Sword about the edge retention, and they did suggest the comparative test, which I thought was a good idea. That's one of the reasons I did it. But there is another review of the Dragon Sword S7 katana posted on the Sword Buyer's Guide forum. I will put a link to that review and his YouTube video about it in the description. Dragon Sword responded to that review where he tested the edge retention on ice. And I'm going to quote from them because I don't want to misrepresent what they said. Our S7 adopts vacuum heat treatment with a hardness of 55 to 57, error plus or minus 1. Since it is an overall heat treatment and the position of Shinogi G doesn't have bohei, we can use hardness tester to measure the hardness of the Shinogi G position for verification. The hardness is much higher than 9260 steel on the market at present. And I also think there is no need to test the steel. For S7 and other types of steel, if we know the hardness, we can find a lot of other professional information of them online. You can see various performance indicators of this material. I think it's unprofessional and misleading for reviewers to use the words probably and I thought an unscientific testing method. So right up front, I am going to hard disagree with Dragon Sword here. It is not unprofessional for reviewers to say probably and I thought. The entire point of a review is to get my opinion on the sword and what I think about it. So probably and I thought are going to come in. It's a subjective opinion. It's not objective. There's just no way to be 100% objective. So I'm sorry, Dragon Sword. I disagree. I think using terms such as probably and I thought or I think is perfectly fine. In addition, saying that there's no point to testing the steel is, I think, absurd. Just because Dragon Sword says this sword is made from S7 and it's got this hardness doesn't mean that we know that that's true. What other way are we supposed to verify it? We're not supposed to verify it? We're just supposed to take you at your word? I'm sorry, I disagree with that. Now, am I saying that my testing is perfect or scientific or anything like that? No, I'm not. This is the first time I've ever tested a sword like this. but I think it is important to do independent testing and not rely just on a vendor's marketing materials. So let's take a look at the saya. This is a red crackle pattern, which amusingly enough is actually the pattern that was supposed to be on my Huawei katana, but they didn't have any of that at the time. The shape is pretty slender and not very complex. There's not really any taper to it, but I happen to like the slenderness of it. The flow from the saya over to the fuchi is pretty good, although the saya is definitely larger than the fuchi, and it could be a little bit better. The sageo, like the Ito, is polyester, and it's pretty thick and of decent quality. If you're going to use this katana quite a bit for Iaido and wearing it, you would probably want to upgrade the sageo yourself. Now, if you did want to replace the sageo, it's important to note that the shidodome in the kurigata are actually affixed in, which can make it difficult to get the sageo out. The koiguchi, kurigata, and kojiri are imitation buffalo horn, is what they listed on the website. I think that's a shame at this price point, $540. I think you should get real buffalo horn. And it's actually important for those who practice Iaido because it helps protect the hand from the blade cutting through the saya. That said, the saya shows a lot of attention to detail. The kurigata is seated into it very nicely with no bubbling or rippling of the lacquer. The lacquer itself is very even across the entire saya. There's only a tiny bit of rippling here or there. The shaping of the koiguchi is quite nice, very even, and there's no sloppy lacquer in there. So that's all really good. The fit of the saya to the blade is outstanding. There's no rattle at all. You can hold it upside down, shake it, doesn't come out, but it takes basically no effort to draw at all. And when you draw the sword, there's no rasping at all. It's a very smooth, even draw and sheath. That said, the Hob.X might be rubbing against the wood a little bit more than I would prefer, as you can see some discoloration in the wood, which is a little surprising considering I don't practice Iaido at all. Now let's take a look at the Tsuka and the various koshirae, and we're going to spend a good amount of time here because there's quite a bit to talk about. So right up front, when I first received the katana, everything was tight. The Ito was super tight, actually the tightest Ito I've experienced except for my customized Huawei from Cottontail Customs. The Suba was tight, the Fuchi, everything was tight and no looseness at all. So after the first cutting session, about 24 small water bottles, both the Fuchi and the Suba were loose and wiggling around. Now, I get quite annoyed when I have a budget katana, something $250 or so, that has loose fittings. On a $540 katana, I don't find that acceptable at all. And I should mention that this is specifically my opinion. I know there are people who do not mind loose fittings on a budget katana. Everybody has different ideas of what's acceptable and what's unacceptable at various price ranges. In my reviews, you're going to get my opinions. So I went ahead and disassembled the katana. I was able to very easily fix the fuchi with just one shim of cotton paper. Now the Suba was considerably trickier. When they first assemble a katana, they will make small adjustments to the hole in the Suba for the nakago using a punch to expand the metal and fit it nice and tightly. Well, on this one, when I took it apart, I noticed that the space where the mune sits in the Suba, it was pretty loose there. It was sliding around, and the punches didn't seem to have done the job. I tried to expand them, but I don't really have anything that's hard enough to act as a punch to move the material here. So I went with what is a pretty lousy solution, in my opinion, where I took some more of that cotton paper, soaked it in WD-40 just to help it keep its shape, and kind of shimmed that portion of the Suba, and I got it to work. It is tight now, but it's probably not a permanent solution. I want to make my opinion on this abundantly clear. I don't feel like I should have to do this on a $540 katana. I don't think at that price point it's acceptable to need to fix the looseness of some koshirae. Another thing I noticed when I disassembled it is that the Tsuka has two cracks in it. Now, one of them, this one here looks to me like what I would consider the quote-unquote traditional crack in Longchuan Tsukas. A lot of them have this crack in them. But there's also another crack right near the edge. So once again, I talked to Dragon Sword about this flaw, both the looseness of the fuchi, the tsuba, and the cracks in the tsuka. And once again, I'm going to quote them directly because I do not want to misrepresent what they said. Our team discussed this issue, and now we judge that there was an impact on the part of tsuba during transport, which made the tsuka cracked and the tsuba loose. It is impossible for us to ship products with cracked tsuka. When the assemble is found to crack, it will be thrown away directly. The tsuba and fuchi should have loosened when you received it, not caused by cutting water bottle. I'm sorry. Once again, I have to disagree with Dragon Sword. The tsuba and fuchi were not loose when I received it. They were perfectly tight. It was only after I started cutting with this sword that they came loose. Whether or not the crack was developed by something hitting the tsuba during transport, I don't think so, because the box didn't look like it had taken really any abuse, which is surprising, honestly. And everything looked good when I first got it. I told Dragon Sword nothing was loose when I got it. They didn't really respond to that. Now, I mentioned earlier that I did the toughness test and the edge retention test on this after I disassembled it. And I wanted to make sure I mentioned that because I wanted to ensure that it wasn't those tests that might have caused these issues. Now, it's possible that when I disassembled the katana, I might have caused one of the cracks in the tsuka. If so, it would probably be the smaller one at the edge. But I don't think that's the case because this katana was actually very easy to take apart. It didn't require much force at all, and I don't think what little force I had to put into it would have cracked the tsuka. So with all that out of the way, let's take a look at some of the individual pieces. The koshirae is still tight, and I am so thankful for that. The koshirae being tight is important for the Ito wrap to stay tight, so I'm really happy that this has not come loose at all. The design is kind of like a snake-like pattern with some raised dots on it. I really like the overall look. However, the casting quality leaves something to be desired. There's a decent amount of detail, but also some muddiness. And the cleanup on the two edges of the koshirae is not done well at all. This looks to me like the cleanup you'll see on a budget katana, and not something that costs pretty much double what a budget katana costs. That said, something I really am glad to see is that the lines of the koshirae are nice and straight, and there's no like little wiggling around of a really well-used mold. So that's a good thing to see. There is one tiny lip on the transition from the Ito to the fuchi right here, but it's barely even noticeable. The Ito wrap is polyester, and I already talked about the tightness. Well, after a week or so acclimating to my house, it did loosen up a little bit, but it's still very functionally tight and very well done. The diamonds are all pretty similar in size and pretty even, and a lot of that can be attributed to the hishigami in here. I can see it if I move the knots around here and there, but it was really hard to capture it on camera, so you may not be able to actually see it, but there is actual hishigami in here. The knots here at the end are very well done. They're much smaller than you'll see on a lot of production katana, and they're on the correct side, something that you rarely see on production katana. And it looks to me like there's actually little divots carved out into the tsuka core for the knots to rest in, which is a very good touch because that's the way it's supposed to be done. Underneath the Ito, the samegawa is real, and there's a variety of nodule sizes without any emperor nodes. It is inlaid into the wood core, which is a big plus in my opinion. It means the overall construction is done properly, which means it will last longer, assuming the cracks aren't too bad. And the tsuka core, the overall shaping is very good. It's very comfortable to hold and move around. But when you get into the details, once I disassembled it, the shaping on the interior is a little lackluster. You can see here that the mouth of the tsuka core does not really line up with the fuchi. And it should, that kind of attention to detail, there should be more attention to detail there to make sure everything lines up properly. I wouldn't be surprised if that is part of why the fuchi develops some looseness. And since we're kind of talking about the Nakago, it is shaped pretty well, and much better than you would normally see on Longchuan katanas, but it could be improved a little bit more by introducing the type of filing that you'll normally see that just shows a little bit of attention to detail. It's not exactly a big deal, but it could be improved. There's 2 Menuki here, and I'm guessing they're iron. I have no idea what the design is supposed to represent, but they are well placed, they do not wiggle around, and they're not so large that they feel obtrusive in the hand. There is 1 Mikugi, which is nice to see because that's a traditional style for a katana. And it looks to be made of pretty decent quality bamboo, although rather than being a tapered cone, it's kind of got a ledge in it. That does mean it's very easy to tell which side goes in where. And it was very easy to take out and insert back into when reassembly. So I actually appreciate how easy this katana was to disassemble and reassemble. Pretty much everything I said about the koshirae can be applied directly to the fuchi. It's got a very similar design, basically the same casting quality. The only other thing I'll say is that the transitions here are perfect. There's not even the slightest ledge. The tsuba is also made of iron, and it's kind of got a floral heart design. I really like it. It is a bit non-traditional in that there's no difference to the design on either sides. And the cleanup of the casting lines and the overall paint is a little lackluster. You can see here that it's already rubbing off in some places. There's not much to say about the seppa. They are copper and the bog standard Longchuan design. The blade side seppa came loose also when the tsuba came loose. The Hob.X is also copper, which I really like. I love the look of copper, so I like to see copper Hob.X and seppa rather than brass. The Hob.X is the best one I've seen on any katana I've reviewed, except probably the Howard Clark one, which makes sense. That was an outrageously expensive sword. But for a production Hob.X, this is outstanding. It fits perfectly snugly to the sword. The Mune side, it juts up a little bit above the spine, which is good because it helps protect the blade when drawing and sheathing the sword. It's overall just a really well done Hob.X, and that's just not something you see at any price point in the production katana that I've reviewed. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So the blade has a 28-inch nagasa, or blade length, and it's pretty slender, only 1¼ inches wide where it meets the Hob.X, and tapering down to about 9/10 of an inch right at the yokote. It's also a relatively thin blade, starting right around 6.5 millimeters and only gently tapering down to just under 5 millimeters at the yokote. This is pretty much exactly 25% distal taper, which is on the low side for a katana. Typically, katana you'll see anywhere from 25 to 40% distal taper. But this whole design works because it's a little thinner at the start. Katana often start around 7 to 8 millimeters thick. So with this overall design, the sword ends up weighing at just under 2.5 pounds, and it's balanced right around 5 inches. These are very normal numbers for a katana. As for the blade as a whole, it's probably the least interesting thing, visually speaking, about the entire katana, because it's through hardened. It's a very simple shape. There's no bohei, nothing like that, but it looks good. I like the overall look, the profile of the blade. It has some niku to it, not a lot, but there is a little bit there, and there's some rippling along both the surfaces and the spine. Again, not a lot, but it is there. I don't think it should be there. The finish is kind of an odd mirror, and I say it's odd because it has this cloudiness to it that I don't really know what it is. It looks a little weird and not truly reflective as much as you would expect on a mirror polish. This is something that was incredibly hard to capture on camera, so hopefully you'll see it. Cutting water bottles and pool noodles did put a few very minor scratches in it. That's perfectly normal. Whacking it against the post actually did more to mar the finish than anything else. The yokote is geometric, which is nice. The geometry of the blade changes there a little bit, although it's a little less crisp than it should be. The Kasaki is polished differently than the rest of the blade, and not in the way that Longchuan katanas usually are, where they usually just change the direction of the grind lines. It's a little bit of a more softer change, and I think it's probably being burnished a little bit differently, which I believe is correct for a katana. The very, very tip is a little bit less pointy than you'll see on a lot of katana. It's not a bad tip, it's just a little bit different. And now let's talk about both cutting and handling. So I've done a couple water bottle sessions with this and cut a few pool noodles as well. All of the cutting was before I did the edge retention test. So the footage you'll see is exactly what you can expect from Dragon Sword if this sword is representative of their normal sharpness. It didn't really cut pool noodles very well. I really struggled to get it to pop them apart. Now, part of that I figured was the loose fuchi, because I could feel it when I was cutting and it decreased my confidence in the sword, so my technique wasn't great. But after I reassembled it, I tested it on a pool noodle again, and while it improved a little bit, the difference might have just been, me having a little bit better form this time than last time. So it doesn't really have an edge that, in my opinion, is quite sharp enough to be a good pool noodle cutter. That doesn't mean it can't cut pool noodles, it can, but it's really a little tricky to do it. As for water bottles, it cuts them okay. I got some good cuts with it. I also got some pretty flubbed cuts. Part of that is certainly going to be my fault. I always flub cuts when I have a cutting session, but it doesn't cut water bottles as well as considerably less expensive katana I have experience with. And I attribute that pretty much exclusively to the edge not having that really nice hair-popping sharpness that you typically get out of Chinese-made katana. Now, that doesn't mean it's not functionally sharp. It is. It can deliver very good cuts. What this means is that it's not going to do you any favors. It's not going to make up for your slightly off edge alignment. You need to be on point to get good cuts with this sword. So in that case, that actually makes for a pretty good training tool, because a sword that is a cheat code for cutting kind of doesn't give you the right feedback, whereas a sword that will cut properly when you have good edge alignment is going to help you improve better. And as for handling, well, when the fuchi and tsuba were loose, the fuchi was really bothering me. I oftentimes have my index finger resting on the fuchi, so when I cut and I feel it move, it lessens my confidence in the sword and it ends up hurting my technique. Once I got it all tightened up though, this is a lot of fun to move around. It has a good amount of authority in the cut but does not feel tip heavy, and it moves very well and feels the way I want a katana to feel. With the incredibly smooth draw out of the saya, I think this would make for an excellent iaido tool, except for the lack of buffalo horn. The other thing is that I was completely unable to get this sword to make any tachikaze. I know some people really like their training tools to give them that audible feedback. Now, maybe they'd be able to do it with this katana. I wasn't able to. I know, generally speaking, a bohi tends to help create that sound, but I've swung around swords without a bohi before and been able to get very audible tachikaze. I don't know why this one doesn't do it, but for me, it doesn't. All right, let's talk about some potential improvements. And you've been watching the video, you probably already know what I'm going to say. First off, the fuchi and the tsuba coming loose, unacceptable in my opinion. That should not happen after cutting a few dozen water bottles. Sure, I can fix it, but it shouldn't happen in the first place. Now, Dragon Sword claims that the tsuba was impacted during shipping and that's what caused it. I don't believe that because it was tight when I first got it. And I'm sorry, that just doesn't make sense to me. That should not happen on a $540 katana. For me personally, I think the sharpness could be improved a little bit. I really enjoy having those really hair-popping sharp katana, and this one is a little bit less than that. That's just my personal preference though. Lastly, the Tsuka core. I don't think the shaping is all that great at the Fuji, but besides that, 2 cracks. I will admit that the small crack is potentially from an impact on the Tsuba during shipping or from me disassembling it. But the larger one, that's just entirely too similar to a ton of pictures I've seen of other Longchuan Tsuka cores that have a crack very similar to that. Dragon Sword said it is flat out impossible for them to ship a cracked Tsuka core. Take that as you will. Bottom line, this sword costs $540. Is it worth that price? Well, I'm going to immediately caveat that and ask, what does worth mean? To me, it's hard to say because I don't think I'm the target audience for this katana. I don't need a super tough sword that's going to hold an edge after chopping into hard targets, anything like that. I'm a backyard cutter. I do water bottles, I do pool noodles, occasional tatami. The tatami has a chance of dulling the edge a little bit, but mostly that's going to be if it's used tatami. As a very quick clarification here, every target, no matter what it is, will dull the sword over enough cuts. Much of the point of an S7 katana doesn't speak to me. So in terms of worth, what I'm going to say is whether or not I would want to pay $540 for this katana after knowing what I know about it now. So my opinion, no, I would not pay $540 for this katana. I think that what the main thing you're paying for here is the S7 steel, and that's just not something that I find particularly important. That said, there are some things that I really, really appreciate about this katana. The attention to detail on the saya is outstanding and better than most production katana I've seen. The Ito wrap is very good. It has hishigami, which is something that is not seen very often in production katana at any price point below $1,000 probably. And the Hob.X is beautifully fit to both the sword and the saya. There's some really good stuff about this katana, which makes its flaws all the more hurtful. The looseness of the Fuji, the Tsuba, the cracks in the Tsuka core, they are just not acceptable at this price point for me personally. So in the end, no, I don't personally feel that this is worth $540 to me. It's not a bad katana, but it's not a great one. It might be the right one for some people, just not for me. And that's going to wrap up this extra long review. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. I release a new sword review every 2 weeks, and I have over 60 of them on the channel, so there's a lot of backlog to get to. But until next time, Alien 2'd out.